you very much. Welcome to the Middle East Institute. My name's Toby Dodge, and I'm lucky enough to be a visiting fellow here. But much more important, we've got, I think, a feast of to come with Martin Chulov, who has been the Guardian Middle East correspondent, who was written for the Guardian from 2008. Before that, he was the Australia's Sun Herald and then Sydney Morning Herald, and then moved to the Australian. He's been covering the Middle East for a long time, writing some superb pieces for The Guardian, and is near enough about to finish a book on the Islamic State, which we greatly look forward to. Now, if any of you have got your computers open, I'm sure you're not on Facebook, if you want to see the skill and the excellent reporting, I would ask you to Google ISIS, the Inside Story, something that Martin published in December 2014, which for my money is one of the best journalistic accounts of the rise of the Islamic State, based, I think, quite intriguingly on one of the contacts Abu Ahmed, that Martin developed, but also a major general from the Director of Intelligence from Iraq's Minister of Interior. And I think this shows what Martin can do in his reporting on Iraq, on Syria and the wider Middle East, kind of bring together a seasoned eye on that's been looking on the Middle East for years with some really almost anthropological interactions with key people on the ground. Martin will speak to us on the fate of ISIS developments in Iraq and Syria for about half an hour or so, with slides as well, and then we'll throw it open to questions. Martin.
Thank you very much, Toby, for that kind introduction, and good afternoon to you all. It's my great pleasure to join you today, and I'd like to thank the Middle East Institute and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for bringing me to Singapore and hosting this discussion. What I'd like to do is just to expand on the role that I have in the Middle East, which, as Toby said, is Middle East correspondent for The Guardian. What that allows me to do is to spend a lot of time in places that matter, in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere in the region. The formula for us is to spend as much time as we can speaking to people in their own communities and reporting, chronicling these seismic events in the region on their own terms. It no longer works. It never really did to sit back from the sidelines and to report remotely. If you're there, you will learn. It's bottom up, it's top down, and it really is a privileged position to be in, particularly in the context of the last 7 or 8 years during the Arab revolts, during the rise of ISIS, witnessing its looming military defeat, and the existential battles that have been fought out on so many forums across the region. So I want to start by giving an overview on how we got to where we are in terms of the Islamic State, a phenomenon that has shaped our lives in ways that we don't know yet, but certainly it's is shaping the fate of the modern Middle East. I want to talk about how we got here, an assessment of where we are now, and I want to conclude with some thoughts on where we go next, particularly the significance of a military defeat, which will happen eventually, and what is likely to become of the organisation's remnants. Now, I know many of you have a keen interest in the region, or you wouldn't be here if you didn't, and a detailed understanding, and certainly my friend Toby Dodge fits that bill. So I'm looking forward to opening the floor up to a discussion a bit later on. I always find that during these talks that the discursive debate at the end is quite fruitful, so I'm looking forward to that productive two-way. But first up, on Mosul. As we know, Mosul has fallen. Iraqi forces are mopping up the old city on the west bank of the river, clearing houses of thousands of booby traps and what remains of ISIS and their enablers from their last urban stronghold in Iraq. Mosul was where it all began for the latest incarnation of the group. It's where the leader of the organisation, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, ascended the minbar in the Grand Nui Mosque in mid-2014 and proclaimed himself to be the leader of an Islamic caliphate. So it's always been the main centre of gravity. It's one of two centres of gravity. It's for the latest incarnation of the organisation, the other being Raqqa. Now, Raqqa is under siege in Syria by US-backed, mainly Kurdish troops, forces, with some Arab forces with them. I'd say Raqqa is a few months away from being under any serious threat, but the military assault on it is certainly in full swing. Now, just before the fall of Mosul, I was in the city. I'd spent a lot of time in the east, from the launch of the operation to liberate it, which was October 17 last year. The operation started with Kurds moving from the north, with Iraqi forces moving from the south and the east. It took them 5 months, so by February, the eastern side of the city was back under Iraqi control, and then was the switch to the more difficult part, which was the West Bank, or the western side, I should say, where ISIS members who were battle-hardened, they were ideologues, they were committed, they weren't going to run. They couldn't if they wanted to, because by that point the East Bank was, the western side was effectively surrounded. They dug in and they fought very hard, and they were ruthless. The entire population of the west of the city was displaced, as it was, most of it was in the east, but the west was more intense. It was a bitter, grinding battle through narrow laneways, booby-trapped houses, human shields, suicide bombers. It was tough. Now, that was won by the Iraqi military, as I said, in early July. Before that, out towards the border, between the Iraqi border and, let me see if I can get this map working. Not sure if it's going to be tight enough. Where are we here? It's probably, Mosul's here, Mosul's up here. Now, that Mosul fell in July, but this area out here, stretching along a whole, effectively a 600-mile border between Iraq and Syria, that border was made redundant by the rise of ISIS. There were people coming and going across it freely for a long time between Raqqa and the other centre of gravity I mentioned, Mosul. In June, I was spending all of my time out here, just south of Sinjar, out near the border. Now, the reason for that was there's a town out there called Baj. Baj is in the far northwest. It's been particularly significant for so many years now, because for two reasons. First of all, even during the American occupation of Iraq, they never went to Baj because it was a town that they felt that they couldn't conquer. There were 4 or 5 tribes in that area that were loyal to the cause of the Islamic State of Iraq, which was the forerunner to ISIS, and the Americans thought it was too difficult. The other reason I was interested in it was that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi himself had used Baj as a base regularly throughout the last 3 years. We know that he was wounded in an airstrike about here, south of Mosul, in February 2015, and he recovered in Baj. We're very familiar with who treated him, the extent of his injuries, and we know that he'd come and gone from there regularly. So I went looking for him, or what remained of where he was, and it was quite an extraordinary town. It was only a day or so after ISIS had been kicked out. They'd moved across the border into Syria. We were listening to their radio traffic, and they were taking families with them. They were taking their important leaders with them, and they were being pursued not by the Iraqi army, but by Shia militias who were reported to Iran. Now, this is an important distinction, and we'll get to that. We'll get to why later. But we knew that by early June, mid-June, I should say, that ISIS had across the border, just south of Raqqa. I'll get back into this area here. This is where their leaders had retreated to. There's towns called Dashasha, down towards Deir ez-Zor, and down towards Mayadeen. So this used to be, this area here, up until June, was their main front. Now it's across the border where they've been pursued that way by Shia militias, and the Iraqi army has taken the city. Hezbollah and others are approaching from here, and the American-backed Kurds are approaching Raqqa from the north. So that's the state of the battlefield at the moment, there are two towns in northern Iraq that remain under ISIS control. The first is called Hawija, which is south of Mosul. The second is called Tal Afar, which is just to the northwest of Mosul. Across the border, Deir ez-Zor, Mayadeen, and border villages there have become a new centre of gravity, and quite possibly the last contiguous area of geography that ISIS can control. Now, if we cast ourselves back to 2014 when ISIS declared, and Baghdadi declared a caliphate, at that point they controlled a swathe of land which went all the way from the eastern edge of Aleppo, which was, I'm not sure, what does that say, Toby? I can't see it. Oh, Tal Abyad, yeah? And that's Raqqa, okay, way out here, all the way through to Mosul, and south towards Anbar, almost towards Baghdad. So that was effectively a swathe of land that was about the size of Jordan. The border was outside the sovereign control of either Iraq or Syria, and there seemed to be no way of stopping this juggernaut which had subverted the authority of both nation states and was positioning itself as an alternative rule to the leadership of Iraq and Syria. And it was doing so with quite some conviction as the Iraqi military capitulated in the north, as the Kurds withdrew to Erbil to defend Erbil. The Syrian military wouldn't take them on in the eastern deserts of Syria. It looked as though nothing could stop them. Now, over the last 3 years, there's been a concerted campaign launched by the Obama administration, which was very selective, but quite deliberate in terms of degrading the leadership by targeted airstrikes and ramping up the capacity of the Iraqi military, which had performed so poorly 3 years ago. At the same time, the Shia militias were raised, initially without the direct mandate of the Iraqi government, but in the last year they were incorporated as an arm of government. However, it remains an open question whether the fight, or their fight, is the same fight as that being undertaken by the Iraqi military, and whether they have a broader agenda. And I think the answer to the latter is yes. As I said, the militias report directly to Iran via two leaders, Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, out on the border. And when I was there, once they'd seized lands, behind them were large numbers of earth movers, diggers, bitumen layers, bulldozers, and all the tools you would need to transform military gains into new strategic realities. As the militias swept in, Iraq's newest refugees were heading to camps south of Mosul, and the Shias were setting up Camp in Barj as a full strategic base. This is significant because this is the first time in the modern history of Iraq that there has been a significant Shia presence there. These were Sunni areas under Saddam. They had remained Sunni areas in the 13 years since. But Iran is moving in, using its proxies and linking up with similar proxies who have done similar work across the border in Syria. Now, this is a new strategic reality for the region. It's something that that those in Iraq and Syria are struggling to come to terms with, because what it does mean is an arc of influence that goes through the heartland of Arabia. It will involve demographic shifts. It will involve securing corridors that are under Iranian control, and it will have consequences down the track for Iraq, for Lebanon, and for the Israelis. Now, before we continue, I shouldn't just gloss over the human aspect of what we're talking about. The geopolitical shifts are one thing, but the refugee numbers remain extraordinary. In Iraq itself, there's still upwards of 3.5 million people who are internally displaced. Across the border, a combination of ISIS's presence, but also the Syrian civil war itself, there are upwards of 5.5 million internally displaced and 4.5 million people who have fled across the border, at least into Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, where they're facing an increasingly, I wouldn't say hostile, but less welcoming reception, especially in Lebanon, where there's pressure there and there's pressure elsewhere to move these communities back to where they've come from. Now, just back to Mosul. This has predictably and probably rightly been hailed as a nation-building moment, a time when the Iraqi state has reasserted itself as a sovereign entity that can defend and reclaim its own territory, restore Mosul as a sanctuary for residents or citizens who want to return. So, in the context of these refugee numbers, there is great hope within Iraq itself that Mosul is a turning point in the past 3 years and potentially in the past 14, the post-Saddam years, where the Iraqi state can stand on its feet and say that citizens are being protected and citizens have a place. But will it be a nation-building moment? The challenges remain significant. Let's just start with some basic behavioural, psychological things. I mean, how do you rewire the psychological state of particularly of children who were moulded under ISIS's tutelage, and also the wider traumatised population who have become so conditioned to brutality. Brutality had been normalised for the last 3 years. And there are dangerous levels of psychological damage for many, and Save the Children is saying that there are tens of thousands of children who are exhibiting showing toxic stress, given what they've been through, what they've seen. Beyond that, though, beyond the raw psychology, which is almost inevitable in a post-traumatic situation, the reconciliation hasn't worked at any point in the last 14 years of Iraq. If we just cast back briefly over the post-invasion years, you would probably know there was a bitter civil war between Sunnis and Shias. The Sunnis were the minority, but under Saddam they prospered, they did well. They had Saddam's patronage. Saddam was a Sunni himself. And there were many Sunnis who were almost overrepresented in terms of demography in important positions within the state. Once Saddam was ousted, the majority Shias did all they could to ensure that they took powerful positions. They took dominant roles in governance and elsewhere. And ever since, the Sunnis had fed off a sense of disenfranchisement, alienation. There had been efforts along the way to reincorporate them into the state, and partly successful, but mostly not. Reconciliation efforts were doing quite well in the relatively good years of 2008 through to the end of 2010, but several successive quite sectarian administrations, some political loyalty directly towards Iran, Iran's insistence that the post-Saddam Iraq be moulded, not quite in its likeness, but under its tutelage, have all reinforced the view to many of the country's Sunnis that they don't have a role in this society, that they will continue to remain disenfranchised. Now, Mosul will be a litmus test of whether the reintegration, not just on a post-traumatic sense, but in a nation-building sense, can actually take hold. In the first instance, though, we've got some obstacles to get over. There are understandably scores to settle with families who would hitch themselves to the ISIS cause and those who had suffered at their hands. There is a period of bloodletting and vengeance that's going on in the city. The same behaviour was played out in 2006 and 2007 because of the sectarian tensions that we've mentioned. And beyond that, though, there is a deeper series of problems that have belied Iraq. Political inclusion and power sharing have both remained elusive for the past 14 years. The Sunnis have lost, in the eyes of many of them, many Sunnis in Iraq, and they remain losers. And why do I mention the political backdrop? And the reason is this, because into that vacuum stepped this terrorist juggernaut, the Islamic State. They laid claim to being the protectors of the Sunnis, an organisation that would restore a dignity that had been stripped from them, to give back lands, to give back honour, to give them a sense of purpose under an Islamic banner. In Iraq in 2003. It fed directly into Lebanon in 2005, where I'll call him the patron saint of the Sunni cause, Rafiq Hariri, was assassinated by a car bomb. That attack was blamed on the Lebanese Shia militia Hezbollah, and it's being tried at the moment in front of an international tribunal in The Hague. We then feed into Syria, where a largely, almost exclusively, opposition movement was Sunni. It was a class struggle in many ways. They were rural poor that led to a protest movement. And the messaging from ISIS then and now was the same, that the Shias were ascendant and the Sunnis were on the wane. The Syria crisis amplified it. It fed this narrative, particularly as the former US President Barack Obama leaned towards Iran. The ISIS message was that for them, the war in Syria that was slicing the country apart was not merely, as the Syrian opposition had seen it, a modern struggle between a ruthless state and a restive underclass. The jihadis instead saw themselves at the vanguard of a war that many among them believed had been preordained in the formative days of Islam. Now, close to 1,500 years later, came waves of fighters who paid heed to these prophecies. And they saw the rise of the Islamic State as a crucial turning point in a centuries-long battle of civilizations. Now, they referred to a couple of hadiths, teachings of the Prophet, to underpin the thinking here, the theology behind it. One of them centered on one that was hailed quite early by ISIS was centered on a small potato field in northern Syria called Dabak. Now, Dabak was meant to be a place where the Sunnis, the Muslims, i.e. them, would fight the Persians in a pre-apocalyptic showdown. For their purposes, the Persians were not just Iran, but also the Alawite regime that controls Syria and Shiite militias from around the region who have come to its defense. And I spent a lot of time in Syria in mid-2012, and we saw the jihadis start to arrive. It was about late July. It was more than a year into the war, and they had piled in ostensibly to double up support for the Syrian opposition, who was doing quite well in the war against Assad. The Assad army wasn't performing well at all, and the opposition were ascendant in Aleppo and elsewhere. Then the jihadis arrived. And over the following 6 months, they came from all points of the globe, gradually asserting their will over the opposition that was failing at that point to press home their early gains in the battlefield, and offered no convincing plan at all for the type of society that would emerge from the ruins of Syria. Yeah, so it was the classic Trojan horse act. We knew what the jihadis are up to, so did the opposition. They couldn't stop them. And they had this message which resonated among many in the opposition ranks, and also within the rural poor, within regular Syrians, within people living in Europe, Southeast Asia, elsewhere. And some of those who joined up didn't abide by the same reasons. They had no real understanding of Islamic scripture or any sense of holy war. Some saw themselves as victims of oppression, and they were the sons of dispossessed families. One guy I met at the time saw himself more as a cultural warrior than the holy warrior, and he argued that joining a jihad was an entirely practical obligation, which was necessary to restore the caliphate and bring on the prophecy of the end of times. And so, all through talking to these young men who joined this cause, it was hard to come up with a common theme, but if there was one, it would have been a collective yearning for the early centuries of Islam, which was blended with contemporary grievances about a humiliating loss of power at the hands of the West in recent years. So, as ISIS has continued to crumble, the messaging remains the same in many ways, although they've had to recalibrate on an important issue, and that is that controlling geography, and we talked about that swathe of land from Raqqa to Jordan and elsewhere, was essential to what the organisation stood for, and that was imposing its will over states that it regarded as illegitimate. And Toby, would you mind just flicking through that while I...
Sure.
Just a few photos, just slowly. Yeah, lands that it regarded as illegitimate and governments that regarded as illegitimate, and setting up a form of governance, a form of rule that was paid strict heed to Islamic teachings and was seen as a superior way of living, and it set itself up as a utopia. The brand took off. This was something which is omnipotent, which could stare down the Americans. It could stare down Iran. It could restore lost glories, as I said before. And now we look at it on the point of military defeat, where Mosul has fallen, Raqqa will fall, ISIS will be confined to a pocket of eastern Syria. It can no longer control the land that it hailed as being so essential to its cause. So what does it do? It shifts the narrative, it tries to at least, and says that, well, geography wasn't important so much, that contiguous territory doesn't matter, and that even controlling small amounts of land is something that is quite an achievement given the powers of the enemies lining up against us. Now, there are still some towns, places outside of Syria and Iraq where ISIS continues to impose order. There are some small towns in Afghanistan. There is certainly Libya. There is a part of Yemen, just a pocket of Yemen at this point. There's the Sinai Peninsula, which has become a stronghold. And in this neighbourhood, in Southeast Asia, Marawi and Mindanao need some watching. They need very close attention over the next couple of years. So I think what ISIS is attempting to convince its followers is that the provinces can keep the dream alive while the centre convalesces, much like the Al-Qaeda branches kept the dream alive nearly a decade ago. And ISIS in Syria and Iraq may have been forced out of the big cities, but it still controls a lot of small towns. They know that a loss of territory poses an ideological problem for them, and that's why about a year ago they began to change their messaging to things such as "we've survived in the deserts before and we can do it again." Those who haven't fled across the border into Syria have melted back into the deserts of Anbar province in Iraq, just as they did in 2007, 2008, when a tribal revolt against the forerunners of ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq, was supported by the US military, ousted them from Anbar. They disappeared for a while. There was a point there where the Americans were talking about a strategic defeat of the organisation, and that didn't appear to be entirely unrealistic until the war in Syria gave them a new arena. So what ISIS achieved back in 2014 will continue to resonate. It will continue to fire the imaginations of jihadists long after the caliphate has evaporated. And a couple of ISIS spokesmen have said recently that it would be a generation at least before the memory of what they've achieved has faded, and I think that's probably right. So all of that's a winded way of saying that the loss of ISIS's territory will cripple the organisation's ability to recruit foreign fighters, but it won't be fatal as long as the group continues to fight on other fronts and continues to vie for territory in Syria and Iraq. And to the point of, can it continue to claim a caliphate on, even if it doesn't control land? There's conflicting theology on this. There's a Salafist jihadi thinking, or certainly amongst some clerics, is that without a caliph, you can prevail, but without contiguous land, it's going to be difficult. I do think they can semi-credibly at least claim to control a caliphate, but it won't be able to appeal to the same demographics and to the same number of people that it did in the summer of 2014. But as I said, there remains an eternal debate about this. Now, The question does remain, however, whether the group will crumble if its idea of what a caliphate is fails. And no serious analyst believes that that will be the case. It will be able to continue to recruit, just tapping into the same sense of resentment that it has for years. It will still be a functioning organisation that can thrive if its circumstances do change. And as I said, they did change in between 2008 and 2011. That lull, where we thought they'd gone away, that was a time to regroup, and opportunity arose for them to re-amplify their ambitions. I also think that the fact that it will continue to control territory well beyond the group's 4th anniversary next summer will continue to be a rallying call for some. Not for many. I mean, there are plenty of people who adhered to its cause initially, thought that, and then found that utopia was instead dystopia, that fairness and Islamic life, certainly under the way that it was being practiced there, was anything of the sort. It was a brutal, grinding, unjust, and unfair system that people were repulsed by in many ways. So it has lost people by attrition, and it will continue to do so if it poses more attacks in Europe or elsewhere, as it intends to do. The risk to Europe remains significant. Toby mentioned earlier that I'd spoken at length over the years with a senior member of ISIS, and that's true. I saw him not so long ago, and he insists that there are still 170-odd members of the organisation who have made it to Europe along the smuggling route and are waiting for operational instructions. I do know, anecdotally, of a handful of people who have come back to this part of the world too. We've certainly seen Indonesians, Malays, Filipinos and Thais in northern Syria, and we know that others have been in Iraq. But the more overwhelming issue is that, and I keep coming back to this whenever I discuss it, is ISIS can continue to position itself as the backer of the Sunnis of the Middle East in the absence of there being any meaningful, inclusive political process. That is the situation in Iraq, where even after the fall of Mosul, the central government has yet to formulate a plan to reconstitute what role Sunnis will play in the government. There is a lot of vengeance being played out in the battlefields now, a lot of killings, an immense displacement, and no real way forward as far as making Iraqis believe that their sense of identity, certainly Iraqi Sunnis, can rise above the traditional family, clan and sect. Give them a reason to buy into the concept of nation state, and they may well take it. But I don't see that as being something that they're going for right now. Now, just a couple of other things to close. Saudi Arabia understands very well that it could conceivably play a role as the backer of the Arab world Sunnis, and certainly the Sunni world. Its leadership also understands that the way that the society is constituted right now, that it cannot do that in any credible way. The new Deputy Crown Prince has been talking a lot about trying to break down the foundational alliance in Saudi Arabia between the clerics who define the national character, and that is Wahhabi Salafi, and the state, the House of Saud itself, who run the affairs of state. They get conceptually that if that alliance continues, that Saudi Arabia cannot credibly, in the eyes of the world, the region, step up and say, we will have the back of the Sunnis. They are doing what they can to try and break that down and to put Saudi on a more moderate footing. That's certainly the intention. Can that be done? It's so the clerics and the national character are so interwoven into the affairs of state that I think that would be it's a very difficult thing, but it's certainly a stated ambition. But that foundational alliance must change, in my view, if the Sunnis of the region are to believe that anyone has their back in the same way that Iran clearly has the back of the Shias, both Persians and Arabs. Looking forward, is there anything that the Americans can offer here? It wouldn't appear so. It doesn't appear that the US or the Trump administration has any sense of a strategy or policy when it comes to dealing with what remains of ISIS after its military defeat. The focus is very much tunnel vision on getting that job done. There is no policy framework even being discussed in a meaningful way, no strategy. Iran does have a strategy. They are consolidating their influence across the border into Syria. They will have an arc of geographic control, which is extremely important to them, and it's something that they're trying very hard to achieve. Russia also sees a role for itself in the post-US vacuum in particular. The US under Obama changed its projection, and it's certainly changed under Trump as well. So have the Saudis backed the right horse by thinking that Trump will have their back? I don't think so. I fear that there are a whole new series of miscalculations that will continue to condemn this part of the world into more chaos. So on that grim note, let's throw it back to Toby and then open the floor up to questions.
That was fascinating. Thank you very much.